الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله يا أيها الناس يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون أوصيكم ونفسي بتقوى الله تعالى فإن الله مع المتقين وبعد. We spoke previously about the great quality of sabr, patience, and we spoke about how it is a defining quality, a quality which defines the successful of the believers from perhaps the unsuccessful. And we spoke about the three areas wherein a believer should try to be patient upon the ta'ah, the righteous acts of piety, and in abstaining from sins, ma'asi, and upon the qadar, the preordination, the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Prophet ﷺ, he left behind a perfect example for us to follow. If we look to the Prophet ﷺ's life, we find that he was patient in all of these aspects. But in particular, today we would like to focus upon the patience on the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, patience in the face of adversity. The Prophet ﷺ, the historians tell us that he lost his father prior to his birth or a few months after his birth. And he lived a difficult, or what some would refer to as a difficult life, but how do we define difficult? A question to be discussed. And he lost his mother at the age of 6 years old. Prior to losing his mother, he was being raised by a lady in the Badia, and his chest was split. And this, of course, is a traumatic experience. His peers ran to his mother, suckling mother, Halima as-Sa'adiyah, to inform her of what had happened with the Prophet ﷺ. They were traumatized, so of course the Prophet ﷺ would have been affected by this. And he returned to his mother. He lived with his mother for roughly 2 years before she passed away. At the age of 6 years old, the Prophet ﷺ, he lost his mother. He was passed on to his uncle and his grandfather. And his grandfather loved him dearly. But his grandfather, again, like his father and his mother, passed away during the youth of the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ was only 8 years old, and he lost another close and beloved family member in his grandfather. He was then passed on to his uncle, and his uncle, as we know, passed away after the Prophet ﷺ had received revelation. But it was a great loss, and a loss which deeply affected the Prophet ﷺ. In fact, in the same year, the Prophet's wife passed away, Khadija radiallahu anha, and it was referred to as Aam al-Huzn, the year of grief. And if we just step back for a moment and reflect upon all of this loss that the Prophet ﷺ suffered in his early life, it is an example for us to be patient upon the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Prophet ﷺ, he did not complain. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ was worried that he was not a grateful servant. When Aisha radiallahu anha later on in his life asked him, why are you standing praying the night for so long when you are forgiven for that which will come from you and that which has passed? He said, should I not be a grateful slave? He wanted to be grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the blessings. And of course, the greatest of blessings, the blessing of Islam, the blessing of prophecy, being the leader of the prophets. So if we go back to the life of the Prophet ﷺ, early on prior to revelation and after revelation, all of the children of the Prophet ﷺ, except for Fatima radiallahu anha, passed away during the Prophet ﷺ's lifetime. And if we were to lose one of our children, for those that have suffered the loss of a child, they know the experience is not one that is easy to come away from. In fact, many people lose themselves to depression and all sorts of ailments after the loss of a child. But the Prophet ﷺ was patient. The Prophet ﷺ, he shone through, and the Prophet ﷺ continued with his mission, revelation, and bringing guidance to mankind. The Prophet ﷺ, he was an example for us to follow in being patient upon the decree, the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If we look to the later stages of the Prophet ﷺ's life, the Prophet ﷺ lost his friend, close friend, and his uncle, Hamza radiallahu anhu. The Prophet ﷺ was patient. The Prophet ﷺ, he witnessed his companions being slaughtered, being driven out of their lands, being slandered, being abused and harmed. Yet the Prophet ﷺ was patient. And so when we find ourselves today in the face of adversity, we have to remind ourselves of the way of the Prophet ﷺ. In fact, if we look to all of the prophets that came before us, we find that the prophets were people who faced adversity. Adversity was from the sunnah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placed within the path that the prophets traversed. To be patient upon the adversity and the difficulties is the way of prophecy and the way of revelation, the way of guidance, the way of the believer. And so we have to be patient during these times of adversity, where we see that we are being afflicted in multiple ways, and in particular an adversity which is affecting all of us, Muslim and non-Muslim. The issue of being locked in our houses, the issue of seeing death all around us, the issue of sickness, the issue of health being a question mark for many. It can lead to anxiety, it can lead to depression, it can lead to questioning why and what is happening. But we have to be patient, and we have to remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ultimately has the greatest of plans in store, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only decrees that which is better for his servants. Whether the servants realize that or not, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what he is doing, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Ar-Rahman, so whatever he decrees for us is from his mercy. وصلى اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين.